Hey, how you doing? Welcome back to Rise Records. I'm Riley, and this is the podcast where I delve into my favorite records and explain the stories behind them. Today, we're heading back to London in 1967, where, in the centre of this town, four young men from Liverpool decided they no longer wanted to be the Beatles. Instead, they became someone else. A band of brass-playing, mustached eccentrics called Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Released on June 1st, 1967, Sgt. Pepper wasn't just another pop record. It wasn't just another Beatles record. It was a psychedelic experiment, a collage of British life, and a manifesto for a new kind of art rock. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll explore how this album became the crown jewel of British psychedelia, track by track and sound by sound. By late 1966, the Beatles were exhausted. Years of touring had turned their concerts into chaos, screaming fans, poor sound, no musical control. Their last live show at San Francisco's Candlestick Park was the end of an era. John Lennon said later, "We were fed up with being the Beatles." So they disappeared into Abbey Road Studios, armed with new toys, new ideas, and a willingness to break every rule that they'd ever followed. This was the moment when the studio itself became their instrument. Producer George Martin, an ex-classical arranger with an open mind, and engineer Jeff Emmerich, barely in his 20s, helped them push every bit of tape and microphone to the edge. The cultural backdrop was just as experimental. London's underground scene was buzzing. Pink Floyd was playing the UFO Club with liquid light shows, art collectives mixing poetry with projection. Young people were experimenting with LSD and new spiritualities. But Eastern philosophy was merging with pop art. It was a time when anything felt possible. Paul McCartney absorbed that energy. He proposed the concept of an imaginary band that could play any style, wear any costume, and escape the expectations of the Beatles. Thus, the Lonely Hearts Club Band was born, a kind of psychedelic alter ego that allowed freedom through disguise. And through that disguise, they created one of the most forward-thinking albums in history. So, let's take it track by track. The album opens like a curtain rising. There's audience chatter, tuning instruments, the crackle of anticipation. Then, that distorted guitar bursts in. Paul's bass growls, Ringo's snare pops, and a brass band blares like a carnival parade. Paul wanted this opener to feel like a live show, ironic given that they'd just sworn off performing. The brass parts, arranged by George Martin, evoke Edwardian military bands, a wink at old-time British music hall. But it's dressed in fuzz guitars and tape echo, the perfect handshake between nostalgia and modernism. The lyrics introduce the fictional band. "It was 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. We're invited into a theatrical world, half circus and half acid trip. In less than 2 minutes, the Beatles announce, this isn't just an album, it's an experience." As the concert continues, Paul introduces the next performer, Billy Shears, also known as Ringo Starr. This track, with a little help from my friends, embodies the communal, hopeful spirit of the Summer of Love. Written specifically for Ringo's limited range, the melody is simple but comforting. The verses pose questions. Would you believe in love at first sight? And the others answer in harmony, like friends sort of teasing each other. That call and response vibe feels like a psychedelic sing-along around a campfire. But listen closely. The sincerity beneath the surface. It's about vulnerability, needing connection to stay grounded when the world starts to spin. And in 1967, as youth culture experimented with consciousness and freedom, that message sort of hit home. Let's go to track 3, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. There are a few songs that define psychedelia as vividly as this one. John's inspiration came from a drawing his son Julian made, a classmate Lucy floating in the stars, and of course, everyone pointed out the initials, LSD. John always denied the direct reference whenever he was interviewed about it, but he didn't exactly mind the coincidence. The soundscape is pure dream logic. A low-re organ processed to shimmer like liquid glass, verses in 3/4 time that drift, and a sudden shift to 4/4 time in the chorus. Picture yourself in a boat on a river with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. That really feels like the world snapping into focus. Paul's bass slides through the mix like molten rubber, and the vocal effects make Lennon sound detached, as if he's singing from another dimension. This is psychedelia not as chaos, but as a controlled unreality. Vivid, childlike, and uncanny. With track 4 getting better, the mood brightens, musically, if not emotionally. Paul drives this one with chiming guitar rhythm and positive energy. It's getting better all the time. But John undercuts him with a deadpan, It couldn't get much worse. That tension between optimism and cynicism is the secret to Sgt. Pepper's balance. It's not all rainbows. There's self-reflection, even guilt. John openly admitted that his line was about being cruel to his first wife, and that it was some kind of confession. Musically, the track glitters with Indian timbre drone, subtle but hypnotic, tying Western pop structure into Eastern texture. This song captures the psychedelic era's belief that self-improvement and awareness were forms of enlightenment. Fixing a Hole comes up next, and this was Paul's domestic psychedelia. He was literally fixing a hole in his Scottish farmhouse roof, but metaphorically, he was repairing his mind, keeping intrusive thoughts out and a creative flow in. The harpsichord gives the track a Baroque pop texture, crisp and formal, yet utterly strange against the lazy swing of the rhythm. George's guitar solo bends and warps. It's one of Paul's quiet masterpieces, showing that psychedelia didn't have to mean chaos, it could mean focus and inner balance. She's Leaving Home is a heartbreaking chamber piece with no Beatles on instruments, only their voices. George Martin's assistant, Mike Leander, arranged the strings and harp when Martin was briefly unavailable, creating something stately yet deeply emotional. The song recounts a teenage girl running away from home, inspired by a real newspaper article. Paul's verses narrate her escape. John's interjections voice the bewildered parents. In a Britain caught between post-war tradition and youth revolution, this song was painfully relevant. For many, it sounded like the sound of a generation gap set to music. Psychedelia here becomes empathy, expanding awareness not just outward, but toward each other. One day, John found a 19th century circus poster in an antique shop and decided to turn it into a song, word for word. Thus, the creation of Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. But what makes it psychedelic isn't really the lyrics, it's the sound design. George Martin and Jeff Emmerich chopped up recordings of fairground organs and calliopes, tossed the tapes into the air, and spliced them together at random. The result is a whirling, disorientating carnival of noise. It's playful, unnerving, and totally revolutionary. Rock music had never sounded so abstract, or so British in a sense of whimsy. Track number 8, Within You, Without You, is George Harrison's contribution, and it's really the album's spiritual heart. Recorded with Indian musicians from London's Asian music circle, it features sitar, tabla, dilruba, and swarm mandal. I really hope I'm saying those correctly. There's no Western instruments at all. It's lyric mediated on ego, illusion, and unity. When you've seen beyond yourself, then you may find peace of mind is waiting there. In the midst of pop art parody and studio tricks, George here offers stillness, genuine transcendence. To some it was dense, to others it was terrible, but in hindsight it represents psychedelia's highest aim, expanding consciousness beyond the self. Paul dips into nostalgia with When I'm 64, reviving a tune he wrote as a teenager. Its clarinet trio, arranged by George Martin, recalls 1920s dance bands. Placed after Harrison's meditative sermon, it feels like a return to earth, a British postcard of domestic dreams. By including it here, McCartney folds nostalgia into the psychedelic present. Track 10, we have Lovely Rita, which is a cheeky love song to a parking meter maid, quintessentially British subject matter turned into playful fantasy. Paul's bass walks jauntily, while tape loops and echo give it a shimmering unreality. The vocal climax dissolves into laughter and strange breathing noises. Half erotic, half absurd. It's domestic psychedelia again, ordinary life made extraordinary through sonic distortion. Good Morning is John Lennon's cynical view of suburban routine, inspired by a cornflakes commercial jingle. The jagged rhythm, irregular time signatures, and brass arrangements mirror that restlessness. John's vocals snarl, the guitars are harsh, it's psychedelia with teeth. At the end, a chain of animal noises plays, each one chosen to devour the previous. Hen, cat, dog, horse, etc. A surreal little joke that bridges into the next track. Chaos feeding on itself. The modern world in miniature. Track 12, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band The Reprise, is where the band returns to take a bow. It's faster, louder, and rougher than its previous installment. The energy of a closing concert is ripe here. This reprise ties the album together conceptually, reminding listeners that everything we've heard was just part of a show. But unlike most shows, this one doesn't fade to applause. it fades into oblivion and leads into the last track, A Day in the Life, the finale of one of rock's greatest achievements. John's verses describe mundane yet tragic news headlines, a car crash, a war count, and a detached dream kind of tone. Paul interrupts with a bright fragment of everyday routine, rushing to work, catching a bus. Two worlds collide, cosmic and ordinary. I guess you could describe how that was John and Paul in person anyway. And they're joined by that enormous orchestral crescendo, a controlled explosion of sound. 40 classical musicians were told to start at their instrument's lowest note and climb to the highest at their own pace. The result is chaos sculpted into beauty. And then there's that final piano chord. 5 instruments struck simultaneously, sustained for 40 seconds as the sound decays into silence. It's like the universe itself is exhaling. In that moment, psychedelia reaches its summit. Not escape from reality, but a clearer view of it. So when Sgt. Pepper's was initially released, it instantly changed the landscape of music. Critics hailed it as the first concept album, though the concept is more atmosphere than story. It won 4 Grammys, sold millions, and inspired every major band of that era. The Rolling Stones responded with their Satanic Majesty's request, the Beach Boys were stunned, and Jimi Hendrix learned the title track and performed it live just 2 days after its release, with Paul and George in the audience, I believe, and their jaws were dropped. But beyond influence, Sgt. Pepper captured something uniquely British about psychedelia. Where American psych leaned toward blues and rebellion, the British version was whimsical, ironic, nostalgic. Tea-time serialism. The album's cover, designed by Peter Blake and Jan Haworth, sealed the myth. A collage of famous faces. From Karl Marx to Marilyn Monroe, from Oscar Wilde to Bob Dylan, they all stood behind wax figures of the Beatles' former selves. It was a symbolic funeral for Beatlemania and a birth of a new modern pop art. Technically, it pioneered techniques that became standard: multi-tracking, pitch manipulation, tape loops, and direct injection bass recording. Every detail was intentional, yet the whole thing feels spontaneous, like a dream you can sing along to. Even its sequencing tells a story, from the brass band opening through fantasy and introspection to that final note of eternity. When people call Sgt. Pepper's the soundtrack of the Summer of Love, it's not just because it came out then. It's because it expressed that brief moment when optimism, experimentation, and imagination felt limitless. Nearly 6 decades later, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band still feels alive, vibrant, mischievous, and a little mysterious. It's more than a psychedelic relic. It's a reminder that art thrives when we dare to reinvent ourselves. The Beatles didn't just make an album. They built a world, and it's one that we're still exploring every time the needle drops. Well, that's all I've got time for this episode of Rise Records. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for being a part of this journey. I do have to say that next week's episode on Carole King's Tapestry will be the last episode of Rise Records for a while. There is just other things that I have to work on in this studio, and they take priority over this, admittedly. Although this has been fun. This has been something that I've really wanted to do for such a long time. I've had the idea for a couple of years now, and I'm just glad that I was able to turn it into reality. And I'm glad that there were so many people tuning in to listen to my rambles about my favorite records. So thank you so much for that. This podcast will be back after a little while off. I don't plan on ending it completely, but there are just, like I said, things I need to focus on in here. But for now, why don't you go and pop on Sgt. Pepper's and embrace the psychedelic summer of love. So, until the needle drops again, have a great week, everyone, and bye for now.